this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to my conversation with Douglas Stone. Doug is the founder of Triad Consulting and a lecturer at Harvard Law School where he teaches negotiation. Doug, I want to pick up where we left off and get back into your book, Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most. You write that we need to disentangle intent from impact. What does that mean?
When we engage, when we do something, let's say you're working in an organization. This is a true story that I heard recently. Someone was working in an organization, and because of the coronavirus, they were sort of thinking about, well, should we downsize a little bit? Should we let someone go? And they decide, no, they're not going to, because that's not who they are. That's not what they want to be. So they sort of carry everybody through. And the person who's doing that, from their point of view, their intention is to do what's right and also to signal, like, people are safe here. This is who we are. And then this person, the one who sort of saw it that way, had a conversation with that person was one of the people sort of in charge of the place. Had a conversation with one of the people who was lower down, and the person said, there are certain people who are protected in this organization, and that's not really a good thing. It's not helping morale. That the people who are doing things well and working hard are noticing, like, well, this person isn't doing quite as well, but they seem to be protected. And so if we come back again to the person in charge who's thinking, we're sending a message of sort of solidarity and that we're a family and we're taking care of everybody, just, regardless of how hard the times are. That was the message that the person thought they were sending. And the message received was just completely different. And it was, that the management team is playing favorites in this weird way that no one quite figures out. And so there isn't this clear line that we assume there is between what we're intending to have happen and how that's being heard. And so the advice around all of that is just to be really, really thoughtful and aware that intentions are, it's good to know what your intentions are. It's good to have good intentions. And the fact that you have good intentions doesn't mean you're going to have a good impact. So you have to explore with people. So, what has the impact been? Let me try to understand it. And then if they say, well, the impact's been bad, the overwhelming tendency, at least that I tend to have in these situations, is to say, it's okay because look how good my intention was. The intention was to take care of everybody. So now that you know that, I guess everything's fine. And on the other end, the person's thinking, it's good to know that you had a good intention, but everything's not fine because you did not have this good impact that you thought you had. So the intentions and impact dynamic is always going on in a difficult conversation. And sometimes our intentions get sort of heard the way we want them to be heard. And sometimes they're not heard the way we want them to be heard. And you just have to disentangle those to figure out sort of where you're getting your lines crossed.
Yeah, I have a story that I like to tell a lot that I think is really going to resonate or really be impactful here. So back in 1997, U.S. News and World Report did a survey of several thousand people, and they asked the question, what chance would you give the following person to get into heaven? And there's a list here of people that, when I read the list, you'd recognize it clearly be from 1997, but Bill Clinton, 52%, Hillary, 55%, it goes on down the list. Michael Jordan, 65%, Oprah Winfrey, 66%. And then, of course, they asked about Mother Teresa. And I'm thinking this got to be, high 90s, right? This is Mother Teresa. Right. She was given a 79% chance to get into heaven. Only one person scored higher than 79% at 87. And that person was the person being surveyed. They gave themselves an 8% better chance of getting into heaven than Mother Teresa. And I think the reason is what you're discussing here. I judge myself based on my intentions. I judge you based on what I would say is results, but you're saying is impact. What was the impact? Yeah. Right. And so I think that's exactly what you're talking about here. We need to disentangle those two things.
Yeah, exactly. It's so interesting. I mean, that's a great story, and you parsed it out really well. That's exactly what's going on when we again, I don't think most people are even aware of this. It's not that we're trying to give ourselves a break. It's just the way our brains work. We move through the world and we do things and we think, well, obviously I have good intentions. That's why I did those things. And we're assuming that everyone else is going to notice that. But we experience other people's actions based on the impact on us. So if you cut me off when I'm driving, I'm going to be angry with you and I'm going to feel like you are a bad person, at least for a moment, even if you cut me off because you're taking somebody to the hospital and it's an emergency. I don't know that at the time. And so I'm going to be judging you not based on your intention, which is to save somebody's life, but the impact, which is, hey, you cut me off, that makes me angry.
Yeah,
So
I think you give an example in the book actually about that, where I may get this wrong. I think there's like if an ambulance is double parked, you have a different reaction than if just a normal car is double parked. They both are having the same impact on you, but the intention of one is certainly better than the intention of another.
yeah, exactly. And then the question is, do you feel, and I think in that case, most people would feel like, well, an ambulance is legitimate, so it's not as upsetting to me, even though the impact is the same. That's right.
Yeah, the example I like to give when I'm telling that story is I give myself credit for my intentions. In other words, if I was supposed to deliver something by Friday, but I didn't get to it because I'm thinking to myself, I put in 60 hours this week. My boss
Right.
gave me more work than I could possibly get done. So I did my time. And I just didn't get to this. I give myself credit for having done it, even though I really haven't. But I only
Right.
give other people credit for what they actually delivered.
Right, exactly. Or if you have a conference call and someone hops on late, what does everyone think? Oh, well, that's the kind of slightly irresponsible person who always gets on late. The person who hops on late is thinking, I just put out 7 different fires with my kids' nursery school. I'm Superman or Superwoman to even make this call. Yeah, so they have a very, very different story about what's going on. And all of that could be true, like different. That's the complexity of the world and the complexity of these conversations.
So why do we always assume that we know other people's intentions, yet we don't take the time to understand their feelings? What's in play there?
Well, I think we assume we know other people's intentions because we don't know that that's what we're thinking. I think so let's say I'm walking down the street and you sort of knock into me a little bit as you're walking by. I'm not thinking, what do I think about that person? Well, this is what they looked like and this is where they stood and yeah, I'm not doing like a careful analysis of the situation. What I'm doing is I'm thinking that person had an impact on me. It was that they bumped into me, which annoys me. They're a bad person, or they like threatening people as they walk down the street. I don't think of that as, oh, Doug, that person bumped into you, and then you just made something up about them. I think of that as, no, that's a true fact about that person. So we're so quick to imagine that we know why people do things because we don't realize that we're just making it up. We got bumped, we're annoyed. And so what kind of person does that? Bad people. And it's so quick and automatic that we just don't notice it. And so we're confident, like, of course I'm right that was, and that's an aggressive, annoying person. And that's all that's where that's at. It's not an opinion. It's not a thing I made up. It's actually just a true fact about them.
So what role does the blame game play, and how do you distinguish blame from contribution?
Yeah, so this is it's a very specific distinction that some people take well to, and some people it sounds more like semantics to them. And I guess I'm in the first group. But so let's say you're in a work setting and someone is supposed to pack the materials for the presentation you're going to give, and they pack the wrong materials. This is actually a kind of version of an example we give in the book. So the easy thing, especially if you're the kind of hierarchically superior person, is to say, your job is to pack the materials. You didn't pack them correctly. So I've identified the person who's to blame, it's you. And now my question going forward is, so now that we know it was your fault, how should you be punished? Should I scold you? Maybe it's just a kind of like it's a glance that I give you that you get the meaning of, which is like, don't let that happen again. Or maybe I literally say, don't let that happen again. Or maybe there's some formal kind of punishment, but the focus is how do we punish that person? What I'm saying is those are the wrong questions. They might be the right questions for like the criminal justice system, or in any event, those are the questions that the criminal justice system operates under, right? Who's to blame and how do we punish them? But in the workplace, really, those are not the questions we're interested in at all. What we're interested in is why did this happen? And then how do we fix it? And you can't fix something that, to take a simple example, if two people contributed to the problem, you can't fix that problem by just focusing on what one person contributed. So the person that was supposed to pack the materials, we have to focus on what they did wrong and why, and how they could fix it next time. But we also have to focus on what I did wrong and why, and how I could fix my contribution next time. And my contribution may be less important, or it may be less obvious. It may be that I gave confusing instructions, or it may be that I left out some important piece of the story that caused you not to pack the way you normally would, or who knows what. But if we're only looking at what you did, then we're only going to fix what you did. And whenever I contribute to these problems, I'll continue to contribute and things will continue to go wrong. So joint contribution is a better way to encourage accountability, and it doesn't have the negatives that blame carries as well. Like, people feel angry when they're blamed, especially when they're wrongly blamed. It's kind of a morale deflator. People don't take risks as often.
Right. Even if you are at fault, it's still a tough thing to hear.
Yeah, and think of what does any little kid who gets caught hitting their sibling say? Well, she started it. Right? That partly comes from the kids just kind of like, I have to defend myself. What do I say? Oh, well, she started. But also, it's probably true that in that child's perception, the other sibling did start it. And so they're thinking, yeah, I did hit her. And so you can punish me for hitting her, but you also have to punish her for hitting me. And so even if I'm to blame, I want to know the situation is being dealt with even-handedly.
And I think we've all probably had siblings. We've had that battle, or we're now as parents, we hear that discussion all the time. So,
well, the whole question of fairness, children, especially around their siblings, are just exquisitely calibrated to be noticing whether they're being treated exactly fairly in comparison with the other sibling. It's just
that is certainly a comment you hear a lot from your kids, is that's not fair, right? And it's like, where did you get that? I don't say that. How did you hear that?
Right.
So earlier we discussed the learning conversation, and in the book you mentioned that we should begin from the third story and think like a mediator. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, people often ask us, well, so how do you start a conversation, a difficult conversation? And let's take a roommate example where two roommates share an apartment and one thinks that the apartment is always unkempt and the other is fine with it. So how do you start that conversation? The roommate who's the neater roommate, the cleaner roommate, they see themselves as having two choices. They could go in and they could say, we need to have a conversation. You're just a complete slob and impossible to live with. Can we have that conversation? The other person in that conversation doesn't feel exactly welcomed into that topic, right? Like, so the topic is, I'm a complete slob, yes or no. So the other way that you could start that conversation is you could say, I want to have a conversation. I'm sort of a neurotic person and everything has to be just so for me, which makes me really hard to live with, but can we talk about that? So you start off by saying, I'm the bad one, or I'm too neat, I'm impossible to live with. And you say, well, beyond those two choices, how else could you start that conversation? And neither one of those choices is very appealing, because one's going to make me defensive, one's going to make you defensive. So how could we start that conversation in a way that puts the real issue on the table, but doesn't make either of us feel defensive at the beginning and invites us into the conversation? And it's kind of like a hard little puzzle to think through, but the answer in most cases is that you can start by what we call the third story. So the first story in that example is me thinking, well, I need to talk to my sloppy roommate. The second story is my roommate's view, which is that I'm the one who's neurotic and too neat and difficult. But there's every conflict has a third story, which is the point of view of sort of an outsider or a mediator or a neighbor who was just trying to help us. And the mediator wouldn't start by taking sides, right? Like, so a mediator is different from a negotiator, right? A mediator is somebody who helps other people work through their conflict, but they're not in the conflict themselves. So starting the roommate conversation the way a mediator would say something like, the two of you are roommates and the two of you have different preferences around how to keep the place, how often to clean, and so forth. And those different preferences are causing some challenges. So let's try to understand them, and then, well, let's do some problem solving. So both people in that conversation feel invited into that because the mediator didn't take sides, but they did describe the problem. And the key to it, the little secret, is the word different, right? So the mediator says the two of you have different preferences about how to keep the apartment. The mediator's not taking sides. The word different is uniquely helpful because it can describe the fact that two people don't agree on something, but it does it in a way without taking sides. So a mediator can do that, but you can do that in your own conversations. If you're one of the roommates, you could say, hey, I want to talk to you about the apartment. It's my observation that you and I have different preferences around how to keep this place, and I'd like to talk about that. That's very different from saying, you're such a slob and I want to talk about that. It doesn't avoid the conversation and it doesn't get you through the hard parts, but it just sets it up as well as it can be set up and on a foundation that makes it more likely that it'll go well.
Well, we've only scratched the surface of the book, but we're already running out of time. So I'm going to cheat and kind of selfishly cherry pick a few questions that I'm interested in.
Sure.
So how does this work with someone who has all the power, like my boss or my spouse?
So the first thing I'll say is it's harder, right? So if you're engaging in a difficult conversation, oh, I just got the joke there. In a difficult conversation, when we're thinking about the advice in the book, we're sort of thinking about it very generically, like just two people. But very often in real life, one of those people will have more power than the other, either implicitly or explicitly. It's important just to acknowledge. It's not like there's a secret trick where that just becomes easy or the power differential goes away. But in terms of advice, there are ways to raise things with people who are above you in the hierarchy or who you care a lot about, like one's spouse, that make it easier for them to hear and easier for you to say. And one is with that difference word. So instead of going into your boss and saying, you're a horrible boss, you micromanage everything and no one can stand you, that's probably not going to go over well. But you could say, I've noticed your management style and it seems like that works really well with some people. And for me, one of the challenges that I experience with it is so-and-so. So you're not judging that the boss is wrong or bad or has bad intentions. You're just saying there's this difference. Like I tend to work best in this environment. And so you and I are somewhat different. And can we try to talk that through?
So I think you kind of have to take the emotions out of it is also what I'm hearing. You have to put yourself in the moment, try to reduce the emotions and just try to talk about it in a matter-of-fact way.
Yeah, that's a part of it. And I also think another kind of tip is to keep a future lens on it. So you're not trying to dredge through like, well, then you did this and then you did this. Using the language of request, saying, I did mess up how I packed the materials. I did it wrong. And so I totally take responsibility for that. And here's what I'm going to change. And I have a request from you next time, which is just, it's going to be much easier for me to do that if I can get a day warning in terms of when something is going to be packed and when it's due. Something like that. So it's future looking and it's in the language of request. Both of those make things easier to hear.
Now I work on a lot of global projects and I was wondering, does this work in other cultures or is it US specific?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's complicated. So the three authors are American and we wrote it. We wrote the book and most of our experience is in the US, although a lot of it has been global as well. I think some of the things work everywhere, particularly everything that's not said. So my generalization is that people around the world have the same kinds of thoughts and the same kind of feelings. What's going on in their bodies is pretty much the same regardless of your culture. So if your boss says something that you don't like, you might feel hurt or angry, And you're going to have thoughts like, I wish I had a better boss, or I wish my boss understood me better. What's different from culture to culture is the extent to which you want to express that and how you want to express it. So in some cultures, it may be a sort of a taboo to make any sort of comment to your boss. And in another culture, it might seem normal and, in fact, encouraged. And so where the adaptation comes in is in whether to raise something and then sort of what the best way to do that is. But the kind of underlying human thoughts and feelings are going to, I think, be the same pretty much around the world.
But having spent a lot of time overseas, I can concur with your comment there. Basically, no matter where you live, you want to be respected and valued and appreciated. But the way you react to the feedback is very different. Some countries, as you said, are very stoic and you don't say anything. In other cultures, it is very common. You're expected to push back. So I think you're spot on there.
Yeah.
Now, the last two questions I have are really more about now, and then we'll wrap up. Particularly germane to our current times, what about conversations that aren't face-to-face? Do I need to do something differently when working remotely than I would if in a face-to-face environment?
Yeah, so this is such an important question. So this is like a variation of the email question, which we've all been doing for 20 years, but it's different now. Now that we're almost never face to face. Sometimes people who are sort of spread across the globe are never face to face, but this certainly puts a finer point on all of those questions. So I think the main thing that I would recommend is just giving people a little more latitude in terms of your judgments about them, because it's just harder to communicate clearly whether you're on email or the phone or on Zoom. There's always going to be some information missing that you don't have in real life. And so you just have to kind of assume that you might have to give them a little more latitude on how you think about their intentions. I know a common example for me is if I send somebody an email that I've been thinking about for a while and it's important to me, and I don't hear back from them in the next 4 minutes, I assume either they don't care about me or they're mad at me. And I come up with some big story about their intention. And it's just crazy. It has nothing to do with reality. And I think we have to give each other more latitude around that. Certainly wait a little bit longer before you kind of reply if you're feeling emotional about something or angry. And, I guess the last thing I would say about that is just you never know what someone else's situation is or what they're going through. And so it's kind of like what we were saying earlier. We know what all the challenges are on our side. We know about childcare problems and the challenges we're having with our elderly parents. But then when we think about the person that we're talking to, we're thinking, well, there's nothing else going on for them. They're just talking to me. But everybody's got the whole range of human drama and challenges and sorrows and victories and everything. And remembering that, especially in times where we can't be face to face, I think puts us in good stead.
Yeah, I think that as you go up the continuum, certainly the more difficult conversations I think are done better or handled better with the higher level of interaction. So if it's just email, people can misinterpret the tone of the email because they were having a bad day or they didn't hear it the way you intended it, but because you don't have the tone. But then you get on a phone call, at least now you get the tonal expressions in the voice.
Yeah.
But that's not as good as seeing you on a Zoom call, because now I can see that you're getting angry and folding your arms. But none of that is going to be as good as face-to-face, obviously, where you can see all of the nonverbal cues. So, but we have to deal with what we have to deal with in today's environment.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right. And I agree with your scale there, that there's an increasing amount of information, but it never quite gets up to the level of in-person conversation.
And a little nuance you threw out there in their last comment as well. I will often write an email and then wait to the next day to send it, because if I'm angry, I probably am going to change the email later. And if I hit send, I feel really good for a minute and then I regret having done it. So maybe give yourself a pause.
Exactly. And the little negotiation I have with myself is I think, no, so I write the email, it's angry, and I think this is the email that I want to send, and it's going to feel great if I send it. And why should I wait? But then I think to myself, if I waited either till the next day or 2 hours, and if I still like it the way it is, I can send it. But if I don't like it, I can fix it. And so I have to sort of outsmart myself from wanting that sort of quick hit of pleasure, because it's like, waiting is not going to have any substantive difference on the outcome, but it'll give me a chance to kind of save my my reputation by actually.
All right. So before I let you go, like I mentioned, we're living in a heated political environment, a pandemic, and soon folks are going to be gathering together for the holidays. Do you have any advice for folks who are dreading seeing some members of their family?
Yeah, so Thanksgiving. So I think it's similar to what I said before about just generosity. And I know it's hard to sort of hear the word generosity when you're the person who feels like you're always the one that kind of makes the compromises or who meets people halfway or is trying to think about others. And then there's a point where you're just thinking, I'm just sick of that. Let's let them be generous this time. But I don't think you can go too far wrong by just whatever the differences are, whether they're political differences or just personal challenges with each other. Just remember that they're a person too. They're going through all the same kinds of life challenges that you're going through. And they have their perspective, and their perspective makes sense to them. If you get triggered at the Thanksgiving table and you're sort of angry or frustrated, ask yourself, what's the purpose in this conversation now? And one purpose is, well, I'm mad, so I want to like yell at them. But often people will say, well, I want to try to persuade them that I'm right because I am right, and so that I want to persuade them to vote for my candidate. Well, that's a crazy purpose because a person who's voting for the candidate that they're voting for is never in the history of the world has someone changed who they were going to vote for because of a 5-minute conversation. So the purpose of trying to change your mind, you can just throw that one out. And so then you have to ask, is there any purpose to it? Maybe the purpose is it's kind of fun, and that's fine. But another purpose is, well, I just want to understand them. That's actually a really good purpose. I want to understand why they're voting for the person who seems horrible to me, but they think is worth voting for. And that will lead you into a more constructive conversation.
Well, Doug, you've been an awesome guest today, which I guess means you're in my bubble. So I guess in full disclosure, I should go find somebody on my next guest to be somebody who doesn't like to talk to anybody about anything, right? So really appreciate you spending your time with us today, sharing your vast knowledge. If someone wants to learn more about you or engage with you further, how can they do that?
Of course, they can get the book, Difficult Conversations, is on their usual places. And then I have a consulting firm called Triad Consulting Group, TRIAD, and they can just hop on our website and get in touch with me or anybody else.
All right, perfect. Thanks so much for the conversation.
Thanks, Clint.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.